Hello, friends, and welcome to Sleuth Studies, the Hardy Boys podcast. This is your host, Kira Drogue, signing on for another episode of exploration, adventure, fun, and, dare I say it, mystery. In today's episode, we'll chat with special guest Mimi Okabe and take a deep dive into the theory of the boy detective, the importance of children versus adults in detective series, and why it's important to study pop culture and the boy detective at an academic level. Friends, it is an absolute honor to be joined today by the amazing Mimi Okabe. Mimi is an academic, author, professor, and lover of all things detective fiction. She is an assistant professor of Japanese language, literature, and culture in the Department of Modern Languages and Comparative Literature at the City University of New York. Her first book, Manga, Murder, and Mystery, was the recipient of the 6th Annual International Crime Fiction Association Book Prize for Nonfiction Books. In addition to her research on detective fiction and manga, Mimi also studies and plays Japanese video games, looking at themes and tropes of classic detective stories being deployed in Japanese game content, as well as gender inequity within video game cultures and industries. Okay, well, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I am so excited to hear more about your research and your interests and all of the cool things that you're up to.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here for on your podcast. So
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to have you. And I remember actually coming across your profile on the University of Alberta website. And I
oh,
remember being like, oh, there is someone out there that studies boy detective fiction. Like for the longest time, thought I was one of the only people that was out there looking into that. And
mhm.
it was so cool to me that that's what you were studying and that you were also, University of Alberta. I was like, the connections are happening. This is so, so cool. So I'm so excited to have you here. I might start off with getting you to tell us a little bit about yourself and where your interest in researching the boy detective stemmed from.
Yeah, so thank you again for having me. Actually, I really was equally shocked by, finding your podcast called Sleuthing Studies. I think that's really, or Sleuth Studies. It kind of resonates with my upcoming book, which I'm going to title Sleuthing Shoujo, tentatively still. So I
Oh,
thought,
that's
yeah,
so
there's a really
cool.
interesting connection. But my interest in the boy detective really began with Detective Conan or Case Closed by Aoyama Gosho. It's a Japanese manga series. And I first encountered the manga in the library of my Japanese school in Canada, Toronto. And through Conan, I was introduced to Sherlock Holmes, and that really opened up an entirely new world for me. And my aunt in Japan would send like VHS recordings of the anime series, like Detective Conan, and another popular series at the time called the Kindaichi Case Files. So detective stories essentially became a major part of my childhood. Another really important influence was my grade 6 teacher, who was a mystery enthusiast, and her father actually was a detective. And she introduced our class to mystery fiction through the works of Agatha Christie. Yeah, it was so cool.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, and I remember being both kind of fascinated, but also like very scared at the time, reading Agatha Christie stories. But what stayed with
Hmm.
me was the question of like why people commit crimes. Not that I'm interested in committing those crimes, but more so, more so like how crimes are solved, and how justice is restored. And when I later became like an academic and I started studying manga academically, I realized that there was a much larger story behind the detective narratives that I really loved as a child. And so I became interested in why Sherlock Holmes, for example, had become so influential in Japan and why so many like adaptations transform the Sherlockian or Holmesian detective into like these youthful characters. And so those questions eventually then led to my first book, Manga Murder and Mystery.
That is so cool. And it's so fun, isn't it? Taking that childhood love into academia. Because oh my gosh, I remember when I went into my master's program, I did my master's in
Mhm.
publishing at Simon Fraser University.
Oh,
And
wow.
I remember walking into the publishing director's office and I was
Mhm.
like, I want to study the Hardy Boys. I want to work with Simon and Schuster Canada. Like
Wow.
I have a path. I know exactly what I want to do. And I remember just the look on his face where he's
Mhm.
like, I think you need to take a second and reassess, my friend. And
Why?
it was so funny though, because he's like, we're gonna have some conversations, we're gonna temper some expectations. But
Mhm.
that's actually exactly what ended up happening is I did end up all of those pieces just fell into place for me to do a really, really fascinating project. I ended up
Oh,
working
that's
with
amazing.
the president and publisher of Simon and Schuster Canada, looking at the Hardy Boys and their centennial anniversary, which is coming up in 2027,
Oh,
and
wow.
looking at whether or not there was a market for a reimagined Hardy Boys series for the
Mhm.
centennial anniversary, which was it was so cool and it was so much fun. And I think about, little grade 6 Kira that would
Oh,
just be absolutely amazed by the cool academic
mhm.
academic detective work that she's
Yes, yes.
gotten to do.
Oh,
And I
that's
feel like
awesome.
that's very similar for you in getting to, take this love of detective fiction that was installed from a really young age
Yeah.
and bringing it to life in such a unique and different and really powerful way.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm glad that we have like similar kind of experiences with mystery and detective fiction. So that's really, really cool.
Yeah, and I mean academia too. I mean, I'll jump ahead to another question.
Hmm.
Um, there's a lot of different opinions on why it is and isn't important to study pop culture at an academic level. I've had lots of conversations with people where they're like, Kira, the
Yeah.
Hardy Boys is a children's series. Why
Yeah.
are you as an adult so fascinated by it? And why is it so interesting to you to study pop culture and children's literature? I mean, the questions are usually there's a teasing aspect to it, but I think it's also people are very curious because they genuinely don't understand why someone would be interested in studying
Pop
pop
culture, right?
culture and detective fiction and children's literature academically. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the importance of studying pop culture and the boy detective in academia.
Yeah, thank you. So, I was wondering too if you had like encountered any obstacles at all in, doing your master's, because one of the things that I had the most trouble transitioning from like my master's to the PhD program was every single time I reached out, I won't say to which institutions, but the reached out to potential supervisors, the email that I received was, we take very theoretical approaches here, and we don't really do pop culture. And
Oh,
and so,
really?
yeah, I was really lucky to have gone to the University of Alberta, where I was able to create my own research committee, and it involved Jeffrey Rockwell, Jeffrey Rockwell, Irene Swinky, and Kaori Kabata from the East Asian Studies Department. And Irene, Professor Swinky, she is kind of like the expert on detective fiction stories. And then Dr. Rockwell, Jeffrey Rockwell, he's at the time was offering courses on understanding Japanese video games. And so I had to have him on my committee. And then Kaori
Oh,
Kabata
yeah.
was the linguist that kind of helped me with translation and things like that. So that was really, really great. And she had, cultural insight as well. But it was difficult to find a PhD program where I can kind of fit my research into. So I felt really, really lucky at the U of A. But did you have any like obstacles or like walls that you ran into?
It's interesting because I've actually started looking at possible PhD programs.
Oh,
I've always toyed with the idea of doing a PhD, and
yeah.
same thing. I'm looking at all of these different places, and I'm going, okay, is this a PhD in English? Is this a PhD
Yeah.
in cultural studies? Is this a
Mm-hmm.
PhD in information studies?
Mm-hmm.
Am I going to go see if I can get a PhD in library studies? Like
Oh,
where
wow.
does this research that I want to do fit? Because it's so different from your traditional like I sit up in my seat and, push my shoulders back, highly academic
Yeah.
standards. It's very different from that typical level of academia.
The ivory
So,
tower. Yeah.
right? I mean, I was really lucky with everywhere I applied to for my master's, they were, and in my letter of interest, I was like, this is where my interest comes from. This is what I want to study. This is where I really want to
Oh,
focus
that's
my
wonderful.
research.
Hmm.
All of the places I reached out to were very receptive to that.
Oh,
But I
nice.
also think there's a very distinct difference between looking at that at a master's level and looking at it at a PhD level. So I feel like I want to come back to that question in a couple of years.
Yeah, yeah, for sure,
'Cause
for
I'll
sure.
probably have some bigger stories in terms of, as I'm looking into a PhD, how many people, raise an eyebrow and are like, I'm sorry, you want to study
Mm,
what?
yeah, exactly. But I'm sorry, that was more of a tangent, but I do have a proper answer for your question.
Oh my gosh,
So,
that was a beautiful
sorry.
tangent. I appreciated it.
Um, one of the most rewarding experiences that I've had as a professor actually came from teaching Baruch College's first anime course this year. And so at the end of the semester, two students came to my office and they told me that they had spent like years watching anime simply for entertainment and had never realized how deeply these works actually engage with questions of like gender, class, politics, identity, disability, technology, you name it, anime has it,
Hmm.
right? And, they said something like, I didn't know that there was so much there. So for me, like, that's exactly why popular culture is so worth studying. Um, it's often dismissed because it's entertaining, right? Or it's strictly for entertainment. But people sometimes
Right.
assume that if something is popular, accessible, or fun, then it can't also be intellectually meaningful. But in reality, popular culture tells us a tremendous amount about the societies that produce it and also consume it. And so, one of the goals of studying popular culture is to take something that feels very familiar and then to make it unfamiliar again. We stop taking things for granted and start asking questions like, why are certain stories so popular? Why are certain characters celebrated? Who gets represented? Who doesn't, right? Whose voices are heard? What assumptions are these stories making about society? And what are they leaving unsaid? And so the
Hmm.
next time, someone watches their favorite television show or reads a comic or listens to a song they love, I would encourage them to ask those questions. And so popular culture becomes much more interesting when we begin to think critically about it. And I think detective fiction is a really perfect example of this. Most people approach detective stories as sheer entertainment, right? We enjoy the mystery, the suspense, and the satisfaction of like seeing a case solved. But when we look more
Hmm.
closely, detective fiction is also asking larger questions about justice, authority, truth, and social order. And the boy detective in particular, I think, opens up fascinating conversations about youth, right? Why do we trust young detectives with responsibilities that adults often deny real young people with? Why are
Totally.
readers drawn to stories in which children and teenagers solve problems that adults cannot? What do these stories tell us about society's hopes and maybe even anxieties surrounding youth? And so I think those questions become more interesting when we compare different cultures, looking at the Hardy Boys in North America alongside Detective Conan or the Kindaichi case files in Japan. I think it allows us to see both similarities and differences in how societies imagine young people, responsibilities and ideas of like citizenship. So when people ask why we should study pop culture, my answer is very simple, right? Because pop culture matters. It shapes how we understand ourselves and others. It reflects our values, our fears, our aspirations, and our assumptions about the world. So if we want to understand a society, I think one of the best places to start is with the stories that this is society tells itself.
You had brought up some super fascinating points, and the one that I really kind of latched onto was talking about how pop culture matters
Hmm.
and how important it is to like just at its base level. It's so interesting. So there was a TV show that was done of the Hardy Boys in 2020. It was a
Okay.
reimagining. It was beautiful. It was glorious. It is so close to my heart. I love it so
Oh,
much.
wow. Okay.
And I had the opportunity to chat with one of the actors from the TV series on the podcast.
Amazing.
And I was telling him about, so I am writing, have written. It's
Hmm.
it's in the academic publishing pipeline,
Okay.
an academic chapter talking about how to use the Hardy Boys TV series as a tool, a teaching tool in the
Oh, wow.
classroom at the university and college level
Hmm.
for creative writing, for film studies, for different opportunities. And the look on his face when I was like, this is something that you can study academically. He's like,
Hmm.
I'd never thought about it that way.
Oh my God.
And it's so
Yeah.
fascinating to me to take that thing that is on in the background while you're doing your dishes, that you're watching a movie, whatever, but being able to take it and look at it with that critical eye and
Hmm.
take the familiar and make it unfamiliar, like you
Yeah.
said, is
Yeah.
just, it's so important and so powerful. And I'm so glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, that idea of taking something familiar and unfamiliar, I forget which critic scholar had said it, but it's not my idea. It's like and just so that there's no issue in the future. But
Oh gosh, no, it's a beautiful sentiment.
yeah. But yeah, often, we think like TV shows and films are just for sheer entertainment, but we often forget like actually there's a whole process involved. The writing, right? The budget, the acting, and the actual like investment that people put into like their effort, right? So it's not just for entertainment, but it becomes like a cultural kind of artifact worth studying, which people, I think, and generally speaking, might just forget because we focus more so on the entertainment aspect of pop culture.
Absolutely. And it's important for there to be people like us that are out there reminding folks that there's value here. There's something to be learned. There's
That's
something to
true.
be studied.
Yeah. We are like cultural detectives, right? So
We are cultural detectives. I love that. I am a real detective.
yes.
Okay, so we've talked about what drew you to pop culture. I'm curious about what drew you to looking at manga in particular, and that recreation of classic detective tales for contemporary audiences. You talked a little bit about, and I love that you pulled in your grade six teacher. It's
Yeah.
it's so important having a good teacher that just instills that joy in you
Mhm.
is so incredibly valuable. But
I
yeah,
agree.
let's talk a little bit about manga and those recreations of classic detective tales for the modern audience.
Sure, of course. So, part of it came from my own experience as a reader, right? Detective Conan, like I said before, it introduced me to Sherlock Holmes long before I ever read Doyle stories directly. And that made me realize that manga wasn't simply adapting like detective stories or detective fiction, but it was serving as like a gateway to a much broader literary tradition. And as I continued my research, I became really fascinated by the sheer number of Sherlockian adaptations in Japan. So, Holmes, Watson, Moriarty, and other familiar figures appear again and again, whether it's in Japanese manga, anime, or video games, often transformed in ways that make them accessible and appealing to contemporary audiences. And maybe I think the appeal of these classic characters lies in the fact that they are youthified or filtered through the point of view of youth. And what interested me most was that these adaptations weren't simply copying like Western detective stories, they were actively reshaping them. So a character like Moriarty, for example, is transformed in the works such as Ryosuke Takeuchi and Hikaru Miyoshi's Moriarty the Patriot, which started off as a manga and then was adapted into like an anime series. But what Moriarty the Patriot does is it transforms the villain of Conan Doyle's story into this really charismatic and useful protagonist who serves as a kind of like underdog hero. And in the series, Moriarty and he has his brothers formed this organization to expose and punish corrupt aristocrats living during the Victorian era. And this idea of a vigilante detective, right, or just a vigilante, appeals to modern readers. And so these adaptations tell us much about maybe contemporary Japanese society and youth culture as they do about Victorian detective fiction. And I became really interested in understanding why classic detective stories continue to resonate and what happens when a 19th century British detective tradition is reimagined through Japanese pop culture and like all venues like manga, anime, video games, you name it.
That brings me so much joy. And it reminds me so much of, I guess, to an extent, so much of my interest in the different iterations of the Hardy Boys and
Yeah.
how, where it started as this 15, 16-year-old brothers solving mysteries, moving up into, there was a series for kiddos where they were, I want to say, 5 and 6, 8 and 10, they were young.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
there's versions where they're older and like
Hmm.
they're the line between spy and detective becomes very, very crossed.
Hmm.
And like there's all of these different iterations and imaginings of the Hardy Boys, and
Interesting.
thinking about what it looks like or what it could look like as a reimagining is
Hmm.
also super fascinating, especially considering, what the modern audience needs and what they're looking for and what they're interested in. Because
Hmm.
part of what I found through my research is yes, people are still reading the Hardy Boys, but
Hmm.
not at the same level that they were, you know, 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago.
Hmm.
And it's so interesting to me to think about what it could, what does it mean? What could it mean to bring the Hardy Boys back in a way that the modern audience is interested in?
Hmm.
And that you're getting to do that research, with a different series, but in real time,
Yeah.
because Sherlock Holmes came so much earlier than the Hardy Boys.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
That is so, so, so cool. And I want to pick up on something that you talked about, and something that, like I said, when I found your profile on the U of A website, I was like, oh my gosh, we're gonna have so much fun talking, because your interest isn't just in detective fiction, it's in boy detective fiction. And
Yeah.
you're looking at that youth aspect and why it's
Hmm.
important. And I
Hmm.
would love to hear your thoughts on that, because let me tell you, I have so many thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's actually a really interesting question. It's a question that came up during the review process for my book. So one reviewer suggested that I use the broader term youth detective rather than boy detective to
Oh,
be more,
interesting.
yeah, to be more like gender inclusive. And I think there's value in both terms. So the first reason youth is important is that many classic detective figures are transformed into younger male characters when they enter Japanese pop culture. And Sherlock Holmes, so figures like Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty, and other iconic detectives often become high school students, teenagers, or like young adults. And although these stories feature a boy protagonist, they are accessible to younger audiences, like broadly speaking, and not just limited to like boys. At the same time, by transforming traditionally adult detectives into youth, it makes detective fiction itself kind of more accessible to readers who can see themselves reflected in the stories. Second, I think the youth detective played a particularly important role in Japan during the 1990s. And in my research, I argue that the revival of the boy detective occurred during a period of like social anxiety surrounding youth crime and delinquency. And so rather than portraying young people as like a problem, series like The Detective Conan and the Kindaichi Case Files what they did is they presented young boys as capable of restoring social order. So the young boy
Oh,
detective became a model of intelligence, morality, and civic responsibility. Um, Third, like the youth detective has also like a distinct history within Japan. So while Japanese detective fiction was influenced by like Western traditions, writers such as Edogawa Rampo adapted those influences, I think, in uniquely Japanese ways. And Edogawa Rampo is actually considered Japan's Edgar Allan Poe, or the godfather of Japanese detective fiction. And Rampo's Boy Detectives Club, despite the name, also included girls, right? But the Boy Detective
right.
Club stories was inspired in part by the Baker Street Irregulars, or the so-called street urchins in Conan Doyle's original stories. But the social dynamics were a little bit different in Lampo's stories. So Lampo's kind of boy detectives came from respectable, like middle class backgrounds, while in Conan Doyle's stories, the street children kind of functioned as like assistants and informants to Sherlock Holmes. And I think what this reveals is how detective fiction kind of reflects broader questions about class, education, and, social mobility. And ultimately, what interests me is that the youth detective occupies a really unique position, right? Like young people are often viewed as lacking authority, yet detective fiction grants them with extraordinary powers. They see what adults miss. They solve problems adults cannot solve, and they become agents of justice in a world where adults have often failed. And I think that is what really makes the youth detective such a compelling figure, and the boy detective such a compelling figure.
I have the biggest grin on my face. That is just as you're talking, I'm tying all of this back into the Hardy Boys, and
Oh,
it's
that's
just
awesome.
it's bringing me so much joy
Mhm.
because in so I feel like this is for anyone who hasn't listened before or who hasn't heard this tangent of Kira's. The Hardy Boys were originally published in the late 1920s, early 1930s. At
Mhm.
that point in time, you had Frank and Joe. Frank was 16, Joe was 15. I had to think about
Okay.
that for a minute.
Mhm.
Frank was 16, Joe was 15.
Mhm.
And by the early 1950s, they were starting to get complaints about the books for a number of
Mm.
reasons.
Okay.
And so the solution was to basically rewrite, in lots of cases, the books. There were chapters were pulled, storylines were rewritten,
Oh, wow.
and that's where when you went from the original. I'm like waving my hand behind me so
Mhm.
you can see
Oh, okay.
these
Yes.
kind of earlier editions when you went to the blueback editions in the late 50s, early 60s. So in some
Interesting.
cases, there are actually like two different stories that are published
Huh.
under the same title, one that was published before and one
Uh-huh.
that was published after. But in the
Interesting.
books that were done after, the
Mhm.
boys were actually aged up. So instead of being 15 and 16, they were 17 and 18 because, and here's the kicker, one of
Yeah.
them needed to legally be able to drive.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay. So there
Which
was a practical.
but it's so fascinating to me because it
Yeah.
ties back to that cultural piece of
Hmm.
what are we encouraging our youth readers to do?
Mm.
Are we encouraging them to break the law in pursuit of a fugitive? No, they will
Oh,
only
okay.
ever drive the speed limit. Like in the early
Hmm.
books, there was there was some flexibility around the law. And
Mm.
when Frank and Joe, I say we like I'm part of this, when Frank and Joe followed it and when they didn't. But by the time you hit the blueback books,
Hmm.
society had changed enough that it was very much, we're not making fun of the police anymore. We are very law
Ah.
abiding and respectful. And, we're going to follow the law to a T. Like if I have to go
Mm.
1 kilometer an hour over the speed limit in order to catch this guy, I can't do it because,
Mm.
I am a law abiding citizen of 17 and 18-year-olds age. That was a bad
Right.
sentence because I'm a law abiding 17 and 18-year-old. Like, it's so interesting to me
Mm.
that that ties in because it ties really closely to what you were talking about in terms of, you know, changing the perception of
Mm-hmm.
youth and
Mm-hmm.
how youth are seen.
Yeah.
It's so, so interesting to me.
And I'm just curious about your own research too, because in looking at the Detective Conan series and the King Daichi case files, I find that um, although we have these boy detectives solving these difficult crimes, at the end of the story, there's always a restoration of a conservative world order. They uphold kind of conservative values. I'm just wondering if in the Hardy Boy series you also see that as well.
100%.
Mm,
It is very much everyone goes back to their white upper middle class
mm,
luxury home and
mm,
everything is fine and dandy by the end of it. Like
right.
it it became a lot more of that
Hmm.
after the edits, the revamp, whatever we want to call it, in the late 50s, early 60s.
Hmm.
There was a little bit more flexibility with that in terms of the original books. But by
Hmm.
the time those revamps came around, yeah, it was very much here is your upper middle class, white conservative, white picket fence and two and a half kids and a dog.
Mm,
That was very much what the books were pushing and upholding, for sure.
mm. Yeah, and I'm just thinking about the Detective Conan series where we have like a teenage detective that is ultimately catapulted back into a state of a child from being poisoned with like a very noxious substance, and he becomes a second grade student. So he retains the mind of his teenage self, but his body is that of a second grade school, right? Elementary school student. And
Oh, this
he
is so
has, yeah,
fun.
yeah. And so we have this grade two student um, kind of leading the police to solving the crime. And no one really questions it. He's just kind of, people are suspicious, like, of his ability and his knowledge, but no one really questions it. It becomes accepted in this world of the Detective Conan world. So it's really, I think
Mhm.
there's like a kind of cultural difference there, maybe between the Hardy Boys and the this particular Detective Conan series.
That is so interesting. And that it it brings me back to the importance of, and you talk about this a lot in your research, the the teenage or the boy or the youth detective triumphing over the adult and showing their knowledge
Mm,
as more powerful than the adults around them. And that's
mhm,
such an integral concept to the Hardy Boys, particularly in the early books.
mhm,
The very first author of the Hardy Boys, he refused to write down to his readers, and he was very much of the opinion that, you know, is the world going to end if kids realize that adults don't actually know everything and don't always know what they're doing?
yes.
And, really encouraged that. Like, he took poking fun at the police to a
Mhm.
whole new level in those
Oh,
books.
really?
He
Okay.
took great pleasure in, it was a miracle if they could find their way out of the police station to go solve a crime, let alone solve a crime. And
Okay.
he had a lot of fun with that. But that
Mhm.
was very much quashed by
Interesting.
the blueback versions. It was,
Really?
you know, oh,
Okay.
yeah, lots of that poking fun was gone because they had to be, I sit up in my chair again. I'm like,
Yes.
respectable adults,
Yes.
but they had
Okay.
to be, more respectful,
Hmm.
significantly more respectful of the adults around them and the knowledge and wisdom that those adults held, which is super
Interesting.
fascinating to me.
Yeah.
But it brings me back to, again, that idea of, these youth, these boys, these teenagers
Mhm.
triumphing over the adult. And I'm curious to
Mm.
just kind of get your thoughts on that and why that's really important, particularly in this genre.
Yeah, I think like the youth detectives victory, if you will, over adults is kind of symbolic. It suggests that knowledge, observation and ethical action matter more than age or institutional authority. And young readers are then invited to believe that they too, right, can make meaningful contributions to society. And one of the reasons I find the youth detective so fascinating is that these characters often become popular during moments when society is particularly like anxious about young people. So in
Right.
Japan, the late 1980s and 1990s were marked by a series of events that really fueled concerns about youth culture, juvenile crime, and the perceived moral decline of society. So, although not a youth, there was one major event involving the arrest and eventual execution of someone, a serial killer by the name of Miyazaki Tsutomu in 1989. And he's kind of dubbed as the otaku killer in the West. And Miyazaki was a 26-year-old, um, 26-year-old serial killer whose room contained large collections of manga, anime, horror films, and pornography. And the media quickly associated him with like otaku or like nerd or geek culture. And fans of manga and
Oh,
anime, yeah, they found themselves increasingly stereotyped as socially isolated or like potentially dangerous. One famous example occurred when a television reporter covering Comic Market, sorry, which is Japan's largest fan convention, reportedly looked at the crowd waiting to enter and remarked that they all looked like, Miyazaki's. Um,
oh my
yeah, so
gosh.
whether intentional or not, what that kind of broadcast reflected was a broader tendency to stigmatize manga and anime fandom during that period. And another major event was the 1997 Kobe child murders, often referred to in Japan as the Shonen A or Boy A incident. And because the perpetrator was actually a 14-year-old boy, the Japanese law prohibited the release of his name, and he became known publicly as Boy A. And the case really
Right.
shocked the nation because of its brutality. So basically, what happened was after, murdering an 11-year-old boy, uh, Boy A basically decapitated the victim's head and left the head at the gate of a junior high school with a written message inside placed in the victim's mouth. It was really, really grotesque. And the crime generated really widespread debates about juvenile delinquency, you know, education,
Right.
parenting, and whether Japanese youth were, experiencing kind of like some kind of moral crisis. And so against this backdrop, I think it's significant that some of the most popular manga of the period offered like a completely different image of like young people. So we have characters like Kanen Edogawa and Hajime Kindaichi. They're not presented as like particularly model students or conventional heroes, right? We have Conan who is essentially mystery obsessive, like a detective nerd, right? He's called
Amazing.
yeah, like a mystery nerd or Suri Otaku in the actual series. And Kindaichi or Hajime is often portrayed as an underachiever who struggles academically, although he has an IQ of like 180, and he doesn't quite fit society's expectations of success. So, in many ways, like both characters from this immensely popular series are kind of like outsiders, yet these are precisely like the people who save the day, right? Their
Right.
specialized knowledge, curiosity, and unconventional interests become strengths rather than weaknesses. They solve crimes, uncover the truth, and restore social order. And in that sense, the youth detective becomes like a very powerful counter image to the negative stereotypes surrounding young people and those who consume like manga and anime, during the 1990s. And so more broadly, youth detective fiction challenges the assumption that wisdom and authority automatically comes with age, right? We have all experienced moments when adults overlook something important or misunderstood a situation. And I think detective fiction takes that feeling and transforms it into a narrative structure. The young detective sees what adults cannot see. The detective succeeds basically because they pay attention, ask questions, and remain curious in ways that like maybe others do not. And I think that's one of the reason figures like the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, even or Conan continue to resonate with readers. They allow young people to imagine themselves as capable, intelligent, and socially responsible, even when adults underestimate them. And the fantasy at the heart of all these stories is that young people possess forms of knowledge and agency that society often fails to recognize. And I think that's a really, really powerful message, whether you're reading the Hardy Boys in North America or like Detective Conan in Japan.
Absolutely. And that social order piece really gets me because no matter how, uninterested or unfocused or delinquent,
Mm-hmm.
a character might start out as being, they're the ones that are upholding that social order by the end of the book.
Yeah,
And
yes.
that's I for a really early Hardy Boys book, maybe I could make an argument for some social delinquency,
Mm-hmm.
but for the Hardy Boys books that most people of this generation of this day and age recognize, there's not a lot of social delinquency. They're very much very strict rule followers, but back in the early days, they were a little bit more chill.
Okay.
And by that, they like to play pranks and, they were
Um,
kids. They liked to do things that, got them into trouble on occasion. And that was very much okay in the
mhm,
original series. But it interests me so much because I think of other adaptations North American adaptations
mhm.
like Young Sherlock Holmes,
Oh,
Young
yes.
Bond,
Mhm.
where Alex Rider, I'm like looking at my bookcase behind me, see what else I've got, Theodore Boone, like all of these different series where your main character starts, even something like Percy Jackson, where your main character starts as a bit of an outlier.
Mhm,
And, they're not fitting that social norm, but by
mhm.
the end of the books, not only are they the social norm, but they're also
Yeah.
upholding it.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So what's what I find fascinating about the boy detective in Japanese manga that I looked at too. So we have like this period in the 90s where the boys uphold the social conventions and norms. They're morally upright, etc. But then the early 2000s, we have works like Death Note, and then later I talk
Right.
about Moriarty the Patriot in my book. But um, now we have detectives who, on the outside, are the model citizen, right? They do well in school, they come from a well-educated middle class family, but they're actually committing crimes behind the scenes. So, the context in
Right.
Death Note is that they have you have a notebook in which you can write people's names down, and the manner in which they die, and it actually plays out in real life. Yeah.
Oh,
And so you have now young boys who are committing crimes. And so it's
right.
a really interesting transition. And Moriarty the Patriot, it also kind of represents that or illustrates that in interesting ways because the Sherlock Holmes stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, is about, Sherlock Holmes and how he solves crimes, right? But in Moriarty the Patriot, that sort of paradigm is flipped. And we see, the villain, like I said earlier, of the story become kind of like the underdog hero. And I'm not sure why this is happening, but there's a greater tendency now, I think, that I observe in manga, where we're not so impressed by like the goody two shoe image of the boy detective, but we're more interested in detectives who uphold kind of or question what is truly justice, right? There's some kind of moral
Totally.
ambiguity. It's not, there's no longer this clear divide between good and evil, but it's more complex than that.
Yeah, making sure that there's room for that morally gray, ethically
Mhm.
gray.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
those I found that was something that I really appreciated about the 2020 Hardy Boys TV series
That's interesting.
is they took because the Hardy Boys is very much black and white, right and wrong.
Hmm.
Here is what's good and here is what's not. And by the end of it, everything that's not good, arrested, gone to
Yes,
jail, everything
yes.
that's good, back in play. Like it's very I don't know what word I'm looking for, but that's the way it kind of lands.
Mm-hmm.
What I really appreciated about this TV series is that it brought some gray back into the Hardy
Okay,
Boys,
great,
and
great.
it gave them the opportunity to, explore what was right and what was wrong for themselves. And I
Mm-hmm.
find I love the Hardy Boys very much, but that's very
Yeah.
distinctly lacking in
Mm-hmm.
particularly those rewritten Hardy Boys books,
Mm-hmm.
is the ability for readers, particularly, young readers,
Mm-hmm.
to make those judgments and those decisions for themselves about what's right
Yes.
and what's wrong
Yeah.
without
Like,
being very prescriptively told one way or
mm,
the other.
yeah. So it makes the readers, more maybe hopefully more critically aware, right? That the law is not always right.
Well, exactly. And it's so interesting just the way that can be interpreted and demonstrated, and it's done so well in a lot of different series.
Mm,
But with the Hardy Boys, like I said, it's very much black and white. This is good, this is bad. There's nothing in between. There's
mhm.
no room for the in between. And I think particularly modern readers are looking to that gray area as a place from which to draw inspiration.
Yeah, maybe that's why, characters like Moriarty, in Moriarty the Patriot are so kind of attractive or appealing to modern readers, because they ask those kind of contentious questions, right? Like what, like you said, like what is moral, what is ethical, what is right, what is wrong, right? If what you're doing serves a greater purpose and for the greater good, is what you're doing, even though you're committing crimes, bad.
Well, exactly. And it's, I always come back to that question about, okay, you're on a long stretch of road, you're in a
Mm,
vehicle behind your suspect, you're chasing them. Is it okay for you to speed
yes.
in order to get
Mm-hmm.
there? And
Mm-hmm.
it seems like a very basic question. And most people are like, it's just speeding. Who cares? Let's do it. But there's there's a lot to come out of that question in terms of, if you want to break it down into that, like my blueback Hardy Boys, speed limit is the speed limit. The amount
Mm-hmm.
of times the line, you know, foot down to the pedal as far as the speed limit would allow. They're chasing, but they're doing so within the confines of the law. My
Yes.
early Hardy Boys, off they go. They're gonna chase. It doesn't matter how fast they go when they get there. But yeah, it brings in that really interesting gray area.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I also think that question is really interesting, because it can be interpreted in different ways depending on like the cultural context, right? I think it would be, it's revealing, depending on who answers it and how it will reveal like a particular cultural or social expectations of what we would basically expect, like in like a boy detective or something. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, I love that so much. Um, Another question for you. So, in the late 90s, there was a Hardy Boys graphic novel series released by Paper Cuts that
Mhm.
featured the Hardy Boys. And it is not traditional manga, but it was
Okay.
very clearly heavily influenced by manga.
Okay.
So, for folks that, and I mean, I'm gonna lump myself in there, for folks that don't know a ton about, traditional manga versus
Mhm.
manga influenced graphic novels.
Mhm.
Can you give us like a little overview of the difference between that traditional manga and something that is quote unquote manga influenced?
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting question because the phrase traditional manga is a little more complicated than it might first appear. So when most people think of manga, they're usually referring to Japanese comics that emerged out of post-war Japan and the publishing industries that developed around creators such as Osamu Tezuka, who's kind of regarded um, as the god of manga, and the generation of artists who followed. So manga has its own history, publishing system, readerships, genres, as well as, artistic conventions. At the same time, manga has become like a global medium. So we now have manga influenced works being produced not only in North America, but also in France, other parts of Asia, other parts of Europe, in North America, etc. Right? So when we
Totally.
talk about manga influenced graphic novels, we're often talking about works that draw inspiration from Japanese manga while emerging from different cultural and publishing traditions. I think the most obvious influence is often visual. So manga inspired creators may adopt certain stylistic features such as like panel layouts, pacing, visual symbolism, or character designs. But I think the differences go beyond aesthetics. So one of my favorite examples comes from a workshop I attended with a manga critic and creator Otsuka Eiji at the University of Tokyo way back. I think it was like in 2014 or 15, when I was a fresh PhD student. And this was part of a summer program where students from all over the world had the opportunity to join. And this workshop, or in this workshop, we were asked to draw a scene in which two people were saying goodbye at a train station. And Otsuka noted that students from different countries often organize the scene differently on the page. So even something as simple as the direction of a train moving across a panel can reveal assumptions about how stories unfold, how readers process time, and how visual information is organized in different cultural contexts. And so what that taught me is that manga isn't simply like a collection of like visual techniques. It's also a way of thinking about like storytelling. So rather than asking whether a work is like really manga or not really manga, I'm more interested in asking how creators are engaging with manga traditions and what they are doing with those influences in their own cultural context. In the case of the Hardy Boys graphic novels, what's interesting is not whether they qualify as manga, but how they draw upon manga's visual language to reintroduce, right, classic boy detectives to contemporary readers, I think.
Oh, totally. And that is so, so interesting. And all of me wants to. I've got a copy of one of them with me. All of me
Okay.
is going to sit down after this and I'm going to go down an internet rabbit hole. I'm going to learn so many new things. It's so exciting.
How do you feel as a fan, but also like as an academic of the Hardy Boys series? Do you find like a major difference in the way that stories are told in prose versus like comics, or in this case, manga inspired comics?
It has been a long time since I've actually like sat down and read cover to cover
Mm,
the graphic novels, but I always because I was a kid that grew up as a like I want to I didn't I'm going to restart that phrase.
yes.
When I was a kid, I wasn't a huge fan of graphic novels because I
Mm,
liked I loved reading so much that I loved the challenge
mhm.
of, pages and pages and pages of words.
Yeah.
So I struggled with graphic novels not because I didn't love them, but because I think I didn't understand the value of them as
Mm,
much.
mm, mm,
Because
mhm.
I was like, oh, it's harder, quote unquote, it's harder to read an actual book. I'm
Mm,
using my air quotes again, actual book. So that's what I'm going to do because I just want to put in the extra work. So
mm,
it took me until I was probably like a teenager into an adult before I started really appreciating what graphic novels could offer in terms of the
mm,
depth and energy that they brought. Um, and I don't know, there's something unique about every iteration and rendition and version of the Hardy Boys. And
mm,
I feel like the graphic novels were really fun for me because I'd spent so many years imagining what these characters
mm,
look like and how they
mm,
moved and how they acted and what they did. And I got to see somebody else's idea of what that looked like.
mhm,
And it was just, I remember when I found, because they're notoriously difficult to find, these
mhm.
books, because
Oh,
they were
really?
limited printing. I
Oh,
found a full set of them at a used bookstore in Calgary.
oh,
And
wow.
I have never spent that much money on books that quickly
Oh,
without thinking about it in my life. I
yeah.
was like, I don't care how much they are, they're coming
Wow.
home with me.
Yes. Good for you.
Worth it.
Yeah,
Absolutely worth it.
for sure.
But it was getting to see someone else. I felt like I was in someone else's mind, getting
Mhm.
to see how they imagined these characters coming to life.
Exactly. Hmm.
And it's such a rewarding experience
Yeah,
to get to be a part of that. I
I
don't know if
agree.
that actually answers the
Yeah,
question,
yeah, yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, thank you.
but yeah, that's kind of where I led into it.
Hmm.
Um, we've talked a lot about reimaginings today
Hmm.
and taking a classic text and bringing it to life for a modern audience in a different way.
Hmm.
Through your research, if someone was looking to reimagine a story in such a way,
Hmm.
what kind of considerations would you encourage them to take as they're taking this classic text and bringing it into a different form? How have you seen it done successfully and unsuccessfully? And what's your take on that? Because I feel like you've spent so much time looking into this
Yeah.
that it's just, I feel like it would be really valuable to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest challenges is that detective fiction changes dramatically when it moves from prose into like a visual textual medium. So in a
Totally.
novel, a crime scene is described through words, right? Readers construct the scene in their own imaginations. But in a comic or graphic novel or manga, the artist must decide exactly what the reader sees, right? Every
Right.
object, facial expression, background detail, and visual clue really becomes significant. And that I think creates both opportunities as well as like challenges. And one of the central principles of detective fiction is what mystery writers often call fair play, right? The reader should have access to the same clues as the detective, even if they don't recognize their significance immediately. So when a detective story is adapted into like a visual textual medium, creators must think very carefully about what to show, what to conceal, and how to guide like the reader's attention. So
Right.
visual adaptations can also add entirely, new layers of meaning as you were talking about. But to use like a Sherlock Holmes example, in The Hound of the Baskervilles, Conan Doyle describes the hound as like as a small lioness. It is savage, heavily muscled, and it's describes, I think, how its jaws were dripping with like bluish flames. And every reader kind of imagines it slightly differently. But once an artist draws the hound, that interpretation becomes very, very concrete. And the adaptation is no longer illustrating the story, but it's offering a new vision of it, as you were talking about the Hardy Boys kind of adapted into the manga medium. But one thing I particularly enjoy about Japanese adaptations of Sherlock Holmes and manga, anime, and video games is the actual amount of research that often goes into them. So artists frequently draw
Right.
upon earlier visual traditions, including Sidney Paget's original illustrations of the Great Detective, as well as the material culture of Sherlock Holmes preserved at the Sherlock Holmes Museum in London. Yet these engagement with Holmes are not limited to like popular media. So during my research trips to Japan, both last year and this year, and my travels to Japan in general, I visited a Sherlock Holmes themed bar in Ginza, Tokyo, where the menu is designed to resemble one of Arthur Conan Doyle's novels, as well as a Sherlock Holmes pub in Hachioji, where servers dress as like Victorian butlers. And the
Oh
interior
my
kind of,
gosh.
yeah, and it was really cool because the interior functions almost as like a time capsule of Sherlockian culture, complete with like memorabilia and posters from various film adaptations. And while such spaces might not conventionally be considered adaptations, they nevertheless play an important role in understanding how the world of Sherlock Holmes is celebrated, consumed, and reinterpreted in Japan. And I think these observations have also informed my own research. So I recently submitted a book chapter examining the representation of a female Sherlockian detective in a video game called Layton's Mystery Journey. Catriel and the Millionaire's Conspiracy. And although Catriel, who's the main playable character, is not a direct adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, the game invokes many familiar elements of like Sherlockian iconography, including like the detective study, the deer stalker cap, the cape, and like the magnifying glass. At the same time, it does something far more interesting than merely like reproducing those symbols. Through its emphasis on fashion, food, and everyday urban life, the game reimagines what a detective can be and offers a really distinctive reconfiguration of the girl detective for the 21st century. So I can't say too much more about that article at the moment, but yeah, I don't think adaptation ever diminishes a work. Sometimes people assume that moving from prose to comics somehow makes a story less sophisticated, but I would argue the opposite, right? Adaptation adds new ways of seeing, interpreting, and experiencing a story. And a quote unquote like successful adaptation doesn't simply retell the original, or else it would be like boring. It asks, what becomes possible when the story is told through images as well as words. That's what makes adaptations, I think, of the Hardy Boys, Sherlock Holmes, and other classic detective stories so fascinating to study.
Oh, I've got, again, the biggest grin on my face because that's just, I love it so much because there's so much to offer
Yes.
when you look at a series, a character through a different lens. And that's
Mhm.
exactly what these different adaptations do is it gives you a different perspective and a different way of seeing things. And there's always incredible, incredible value in that. And I'm so glad that you pointed that out.
Yeah, and it's always so fruitful to not think of, what is successful and unsuccessful, but as you indicate, like pay attention to how they're adapting the Hardy Boys or, the Sherlock Holmes series. And what is that revealing about our contemporary society in terms of, issues of gender or race or class? Like that's like what I find most fascinating about adaptations.
Oh, absolutely. Oh my gosh. This has been so wonderful and I have learned so much and I'm so grateful to you for your time and your expertise and your research. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for looking into this.
Thank you.
It is so cool to find a kindred spirit that's also, doing this research and yeah, I am feeling very, very inspired. So thank you so very much.
Likewise, like I'm just so happy to be here and that you have this wonderful podcast that I could be part of. And I hope we can continue this conversation like outside on the podcast as well. It's okay.
I would love that so much. I'm like, nerd me has printed copies of some of your research
Oh my
because
goodness. Okay.
I'm enjoying it so
Oh,
much
thank
and
you.
taking it and thinking about it critically and figuring out, how it fits into the work that I'm doing. We actually cite some of the same sources and I was like, yes, I'm on the
Oh,
right track.
okay. Oh, that's awesome.
So yes, many, many discussions will continue, but I want to thank you again so much for taking the time and for being here.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Friends, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's been such fun chatting with Mimi, and I want to take a moment to thank her again for her time, energy, and expertise. Until next time, this is Kira Drogue, host of Sleuth Studies, the Hardy Boys podcast, signing off. The absolutely stunning original theme music you've just enjoyed was composed by Jeff Lee. Sleuth Studies is grateful for the support of Volunteer Alberta, the Canadian Red Cross, the GloCal Foundation of Canada, and the Government of Canada. For more information about Sleuth Studies, the Hardy Boys podcast, please visit www.sleuthstudies.ca or find us on social media @sleuthstudies.